Morning. Is my mic on? I can't even tell. Is it on? Oh, okay, cool. All right. There's a difference between senior pastors and senior citizens, so please don't get them mixed up. And it was my son's first birthday yesterday. And then my in-laws, they were waiting for the head pastor of our church to come. So Sarah tried to explain to them that we don't have one. So when Sam came in, we just said, that's him. So that's how those things work. Interesting. So I've been off for 6 months. It's weird being back up here. In fact, when I got here, I was about to get ready for praise, and I realized I forgot to put on my microphone because I haven't done this in so long, so bear with me. I'm incredibly nervous, and I'm also doing a sermon that is probably one of the most difficult sermons that I've ever done. The topic is Life is Beautiful. So Sam, he's in charge of assigning us the topics for our sermons. So I looked at the calendar, and I like to know like a year ahead of time what I'm going to preach about. So I was going through, I was like, yeah, this is cool. Oh, I can't wait for this one. And I got Life is Beautiful. And I was like, why is he doing this? I know, because sometimes Sam picks topics for us based on like certain passions that we have and things that we like. I was like, I don't get this. So one time I had a chance to ask him, I was like, I noticed that you assigned me for Life is Beautiful. Like, why did you assign that chapter to me? I don't even know what that means. And he said, because you don't think life is beautiful. And yeah, these pagans that I'm there, they're funny. That's all the Korean I know. But this is probably the most difficult sermon I've ever had to prepare for. In fact, I started preparing for this back in May, early this month, because it's down, boy, down. And but it's hard because the pulpit is something to be respected, and it's hard to come up here and talk about something that you have difficulty believing in. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm going to be hypocritical about what I'm going to talk about today. It just means that as I talk about what the scriptures have to say about life being beautiful or the beauty of life, it just means that I'm a student along with you guys. And I think that's always true. But I think for me especially true today because I have difficulty believing that life is beautiful many times. Even though I read scripture and I find so much beauty in the scriptures and how the scriptures seem to speak to our experiences every day. So I am with you today in the sense that I'd be sitting with you, but I can't preach from down there, so I'm going to just come up here and talk to you about what the scriptures have to talk about. Life is beautiful. And I really had to think in the last couple of months, and did I find some moments of beauty within my life? I did, and this is going to be kind of personal for me. And it's not that I'm coming up here and giving you an example of self-aggrandizement or things like that, which I really dislike from the pulpit, but rather it needs to be personal to some extent because I have difficulties with this topic. Life is beautiful. I think it was an Academy Award-winning movie too. No, I think the best actor was from that movie. But one of the reasons why I find life to be so difficult and not necessarily beautiful is there's so much inconsistencies in life, right? Every time I turn on the news or something like that, there's some type of tragedy. And this past week when I was looking at the news and I saw another Malaysian airliner, tragedy, I was like, what's going on? I thought it was the same one from earlier this year, but it wasn't. It was something completely different. And I think that's kind of weird because there's so many contradictions, inconsistencies, and things that are juxtaposed together. There's goodness and evil, and then there's joy, and then there's tragedy, and it just comes together like it's nothing. And you see that all the time in our world, especially in the news. And the news is so interesting. So you flip on the news or something like that, right? And then everybody has a solemn face. In breaking news today, a Malaysian airliner was just shut down. Everybody has a solemn face. About 2 seconds later, and summer barbecues are back in time. And then it just goes from this tragedy to something that's very, very different, and then it's something kind of insignificant but somehow joyous, and it's juxtaposed together. And I was like, well, where do you find the meaning in this, right? And then go now on weather, and you get this blonde lady with tight clothes who calls herself a meteorologist and just points to numbers on a board and talks about the weather. And I just went from tragedy to summer barbecues to a blonde talking about, no offense blondes out there, who are meteorologists talking about the weather. I don't know if they really know what they're talking about. I see it on TV. I was watching the TV show Suits. Anybody watch Suits? Yeah, all right. So I'll just talk to you. And But in the show Suits, it's a constant barrage of backstabbing and finding leverage over other people in order to get them to do things. A lot of manipulation, and right after that, they get together and have drinks, and they have these tender moments of goodness and morality, and then they go back to talking about, you just got to do what you got to do, and then they backstab each other again. And I was like, what is up with this? And the show is like that every single week, and I watch it every week. I love it. But there's something so meaningless about it. It's ethics intermingled with cutthroat world of business and backstabbing, and they say that's life. It's in the movie Parenthood, not the TV show Parenthood. You got to understand, I'm older than you guys. But there was this movie a long time ago. It's a classic now. It's called Parenthood with this guy named Steve Martin. You know who Steve Martin is? All right, thank you. One of you. And Steve Martin does this movie. It does this kind of a profound kind of moment within that movie where grandma is talking, and husband and wife, Steve Martin and his wife, is having difficulties in their marriage, and this grandma says this. They're just yelling at each other, and she starts talking. And she says, when I was 19, Grandpa took me on a roller coaster. And the husband goes, oh? Up, down, oh, what a ride. What a great story, sarcastically. And then she says this, I always wanted to go again. It was just so interesting to me that a ride could make me so frightened, so scared, so sick, so excited, and so thrilled all together. Some didn't like it. They went out on the merry-go-round that just goes round and round, nothing. I like the roller coaster. You get more of it, and you get more out of it. And what she's saying is life is like a roller coaster, right? You've heard that before. And she's very confused and at the same time exhilarated by the fact that how can a ride give you so much joy and so much exhilaration and so much fear and so much, almost tragic moments all in one? And the meaning that she finds in life is just the acceptance of the fact that life is like that there's ups and downs and inconsistencies in life. I found that out yesterday when I was watching my father come in. I found out my father has cancer this past week. While at the same time, we were preparing for my son's first birthday, where we were celebrating his first year of life and potential death and life coming together as one. I saw my father come in, and I was holding Timothy, or Timmy as we affectionately call him. And my dad came, and he didn't smile. He's not a really smiley guy. I kind of got that from him. And he kind of took Timothy from me, but he had this look on his face, knowing what his condition was. And at the same time, at this birthday party, we're celebrating the first year of a baby's life. And he looked different. When I was talking to my stepmother, she said, your dad stopped exercising this week. And I was like, why? He said, well, why should I exercise when, I might die soon? And seeing the contradictions in that. And finding that things become meaningless when time seems to have gotten short. In such a weird, inconsistent, wacky, contradictory world, how do we find meaning or the beauty of life in such things? Is meaning and beauty really found in just the acceptance of those things? But at the same time, it seems like we're always longing for more. We want something past the superficial, even though we may have moments of superficiality. I see that in the movie American Beauty. I don't know if you've seen that movie, where there's a scene where this kid videotapes just mundane moments of life. And there's a scene where he's just sitting there transfixed and watching this plastic bag being moved around by the wind, and he's seeing so much beauty in that because he understands that the world is so superficial. He wants something deeper. To see something as mundane as a plastic bag being whipped around by the wind is so meaningful to him. But at this point, you can do a few things when you understand that's what the world is like. You can look at the world and accept it as it is, or you can look at the world differently from an outside perspective. And these outside perspectives are incredibly valuable because we do this all the time when we look at the problems of others. And we see other problems so clearly because we're outside of the action. And when we're so close to the action and we're close to our problems, sometimes we can't see those things very clearly. It's that quote-unquote different perspective, outside perspective that sometimes we seek. We sometimes have a clearer perspective on other situations because we are not so close to that action. And this is why we seek out the advice or perspectives of others. as we live our lives, because sometimes we need an impartial perspective, a different take on things in order to find the meaning in the decisions that we make in the lives that we live. But when I talk to people about this, the number one reaction that I normally get when you talk about the inconsistencies and contradictions of life is just accept it, right? As it is. And I know what you're saying. I think it's really good advice. I think it's fine. It's a fine and really great advice, and it's a very wise advice. Can't change the world, so it's okay, accept it. But the problem is, if it just stays at that level, I would argue that you're not being true to who you are. We don't really accept things until we realize that we can't do anything about them. And if we stay at that point, I don't think you're being true to yourself, and I think you're missing out on something greater. And you're denying what your soul is actually craving. Your soul actually craves more than the meaninglessness of this world. But if you stay at that level, you will live a life of contradiction, of inconsistencies, and you have become a slave to your environment, the same environment that you see the inconsistencies in, that is just as contradictory and inconsistent as the identity that your soul says is completely in violation of what your soul truly wants. Something that transcends this world, something that is out of this world, something that is otherworldly, namely something that is more, something that is eternal, something that is beautiful. Right? And if you don't really believe that our world is beautiful, if you don't really believe that our world is meaningless, I invite you to go watch Transformers. For 2 hours and 45 minutes of your life, you will understand what meaninglessness is. And you will never get those 2 hours and 40 minutes of your life back. Or your money. They will not give it back to you. And the person that's sitting next to you talking during the whole movie is more interesting than the movie itself. Okay? A contradiction, an inconsistent view of life without transcending that life, and it leads to a denial of who you really are, a denial of your identity as you know it. But a contradictory, inconsistent view of life seen through the lens of an outside perspective leads to beauty, and a realization of a life full of beauty that is lived with a clear understanding of who you really are, your true identity. Your life and your soul are one, as your soul thirsts for something transcendent, something eternal, something beautiful. Right? And the text that we're about to look at today, we're going to see the observations of a man, a wise man, one of the wisest men in his time, except for the fact that he had hundreds of wives and concubines, not so wise, and it led to his downfall. He saw the inconsistencies and contradictions of life and concludes that everything under the sun is meaningless. There's no meaning in anything under the sun. And when I think of beauty in the Bible, or what is beautiful, or to define what beauty really is, it always leads me back to this passage that we're going to look at. It's one of the most famous passages in Scripture, and our text comes from Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 1 through 14. But before we get to that chapter itself, I want to take you to chapter 1, verse 1, where it says this. It's up on the board. Everything is meaningless, the words of the teacher, son of David. We think that's Solomon, king in Jerusalem. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher, utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. And as you read through Ecclesiastes, it's sometimes frustrating to read because he seems to contradict himself constantly, and his thoughts are very inconsistent. Right? He says things like, wisdom is folly. Wisdom is ultimately meaningless. Because look at the fool and look at the wise. What happens to the fool eventually in his life? He dies, right? So does the wise. Well, later on he says, even though the fool dies and so does the wise, it's better to be wise than a fool. But if you get too cocky, realize that you're going to die just like the fool does. And when I was reading it, I was so frustrated. This guy is so inconsistent. This guy is so contradictory. But then as he talks about life, isn't life contradictory? Isn't life inconsistent? And therefore he reflects that in what he writes. He says everything is meaningless. And he comes to chapter 3, and this is where I want to pick up, and if you want to read along with me from the screen, he says this: there is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens. A time to be born, and a time to die. A time to plant, and a time to uproot. A time to kill, and a time to heal. A time to tear down, and a time to build. A time to weep, and a time to laugh. A time to mourn, and a time to dance. a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. He's saying that there's these inconsistencies in life. There's things in life that are juxtaposed together. There's tragedy, and then there's joy. There's life, and there's death, and there's birth, and there's death. And all these things come together. And in his observations of life, he found that all these things are meaningless, but at the same time, there's a reason and a season for everybody's life. That something is in control. There's a method to the madness of the world around us. And it goes on in verse 9, and he says, "What do workers gain from their toil? I have seen the burden God has laid on the human race." And he says, he has made everything beautiful in its time. And I think that phrase in itself is beautiful. He has also set eternity in the human heart. Yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. I know that there is nothing better for people than to be happy and to do the good while they live, and to do good while they live, that each of them may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all their toil. This is the gift of God. I know that everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it and nothing taken from it. God does it so that people will fear him. And what he's saying is this: there's a reason that God is in control in the midst of all this meaninglessness. But he's also saying is, don't accept the world for what it is and just stay there. Accept the fact that there's no meaning in this world. Because what Solomon is saying is everything under the sun, everything in this world is meaningless. And this is a guy that had it all. He was rich. He had fame. He had wisdom. He had power. He had all those things. And he has concluded that everything is just so meaningless. And I know what some of you guys are saying. You know, I would like the opportunity to have those things and come to the conclusion myself. I've said that to God many times, and he never, ever answers my prayer. Every time I pray that, and then I scratch off a lottery ticket. But he just teaches me humility instead. Right? That God is in control. God is in all of these things. But then he says he makes everything beautiful in its time. And some translations say he makes everything appropriate in its time. Why? Because he's placed eternity in the hearts of men. I think that's so significant. He's saying, and Solomon, you know, he lived a long time ago. But in his life, up to that point in his life, as he's musing about life and his observations of life, he has seen God work enough in his short life that God has made things beautiful in its time. And he's confident that he can say that to us right now, even though we're living hundreds and thousands of years after he did. And he's confident that even in our lifetime, that God would make things beautiful in its time. Why? Because God has placed eternity within our hearts. We have this thirst for the infinite, and we have this thirst for the eternal. And I've spoken about this before. And if we, again, place this passage in the context of salvation history, of what God is doing in Scripture and in history, that God is a God of salvation, and his purpose for us is to save us and redeem us from a fallen state. We see this thirst for the eternal, the eternity that God has placed within our hearts, fulfilled when Jesus comes. We see that in John chapter 4 when he talks to the women at the well. And he says, you know, I want to give you some water where you never have to thirst again. And she says, well, I want some of that water. Why? Because this passage tells us that God has placed eternity in the hearts of men and women. And she knows it. She has a thirst for this eternal nature, eternity. And eventually Jesus says, I am the one who will fulfill you. I am that water that you will drink, that you'll never thirst again. Right? We all have this. We all want to live forever. You may think, no, we don't. How many movies have you seen where they want to try to live forever? How many movies have you seen where people want to manipulate time and to go back to certain parts of time? How many times have you seen companies that are named after people? Dell Computers named after Michael Dell. Irvine is named after some dude named Irvine. Anaheim, I don't know where that came from, right? Huh? I don't know where it came from. We all want to live forever. We all want to make sure that our name lives forever. We want to make sure that we have sons, so our sons will put out our name, and our name will never, ever die. We have this thirst for the eternal. Right? But at the same time, it's contradictory too, isn't it? Because some of us have bucket lists. You guys have a bucket list? Yeah, we all have bucket lists. Why? Because we want to live forever. At the same time, we know that life is short. Right? But then I saw this kind of contradictory nature in terms of eternity and time with my own mother. My own mother was an incredible overachiever. I found out later at my mom's funeral, the pastor explained this to me, and I had never known this, that, your mom was an incredible woman. And I was like, why was she so incredible? She said she went to college at a time that most people didn't go to college. And during that time, women definitely didn't go to college, but she did. And that was a small percentage of the population. He said, well, okay, that's pretty incredible. He thought, it's not even that. She majored in chemistry. So in a time where a lot of women didn't even go to college, out of the women who did go to college, they certainly didn't major in chemistry. So what your mom did was incredible. She always had a thirst for something greater than the life that she had lived, because she had lived a life that was very hurtful. And it came from her own father. And she always wanted to transcend that. She wanted to be better than that. It was all about making sure that she had some type of security in something that she found in the works of her own hands. It was a huge deal for her. One of us had to go to Harvard or Stanford. It certainly wasn't me. It was my younger brother, because it was such a big deal. Right? And I saw that drive her entire life, that she was searching for something that was missing. She didn't find it in church until later on in her life when they realized that she had cancer of the liver. And I remember talking to her once where I took her to the doctor, and she handed me a $100 bill. She said, why are you giving me this? I don't need this. You don't need to pay me for taking me to the doctor. She said, to me, that's worthless. It's just a piece of paper. I'm not going to take it with me. You take it. I never, ever heard my own mother say anything like that about money. Remember as a child going through, why is money so important to you? So money is everything. Money is incredibly important. You don't know. And I didn't know. But towards the end of her life, when she realized that time was short, she'll tell me, Steve, I've been reading the Bible a lot. Man, it's fun. It's awesome. And all the things that was so meaningful for her in her life when time got cut short, when she couldn't see past the constraints and confines of her life, she finally came to the conclusion that Solomon did with that being in the same circumstance, that everything is meaningless. And she found meaning in something that was outside of herself. She found some type of meaning that was outside of this world. When Solomon says there is nothing new under the sun, that there's no meaning in this world under the sun, he wasn't kidding at all. Right? Not at all. See, the meaninglessness of the world around us becomes meaningful because we acknowledge and believe what Solomon understood, that there is a season and purpose for everything. We are already in tune with this because we want to be consistent with who we are. How many times have you heard people say, I do this? Why do you do this? That's who I am. That's my personality. That's what I do. And God has placed that within you. God has placed that within you, that you want to be consistent with your own identity. You know that there's something bigger and greater. And our identity is found in the fact that God has placed eternity in the hearts of men. I envy people who know that. I was talking to one of our brothers at our church. We were at his house. I won't say his name, but he talks a lot during sermons. And I was saying, Danny Reed, how's work? He's like, oh, it's great. And Danny's very animated. He's a preacher that doesn't preach scriptures, but he preaches on everything else. And he's very animated. So how do you like your job? He's like, I love it. He says it just like that with facial expressions. And then he was talking a little bit more. So I was like, why do you love it? He's all, And he was barbecuing at the same time, or grilling, or what do you want to call it. He said, I'm good at it. And usually when people say I'm good at it to me, I was like, dude, you arrogant, narcissistic jerk. But then I was like, I didn't get that impression when he said that. He just said, I'm really good at it. And I was really envious. I was like, he knows who he is, and he knows what he's good at. And he also said this, I'm a lot wiser now. And I was like, uh-oh, got cocky again. And I learned some things after doing this. I know how to deal with people a lot better now. But I'm good at this. And he started talking about money. And then he started becoming Yoda. He said, it's not good to have too much money, but it's not good to have too little money. And he stopped. Because the great people always say something profound, short, and they just stop. And that's what he did. But I was envious because that's what I've been looking for my entire life. Don't you want to find something that is you? Right? Don't you want to find something that is consistent with who you are? That there's this connection between who you are and what you're doing and go, this is just me. And when you say things like, I'm good at it, it's not being cocky, it's not being narcissistic, it's not being arrogant. You're just being honest with who you are and you're telling people that, and it comes across that way. And that's pretty awesome. And I think that's what Solomon's trying to teach you. You have a thirst for the eternal. You can't fill it with anything in this world. And when you realize that this world is meaningless and there's no meaning in this world, yet at the same time your soul desires meaning, it should tell you that if there's nothing meaningful in this world, but my soul desires what is meaningful, if everything under the sun is meaningless, then I must look above the sun for something that's meaningful. And when we realize that, and that's what Solomon says, God makes everything beautiful in its time. I struggled with that a lot this past couple of weeks. I applied to a speech therapy program. And not that easy to get into, but I was told that, you're a guy and you're a minority in that, so you'll probably get in. So I applied, and I got in. And I went to the informational meeting. There was like 35 people in the room, and they said that 260 people had applied and 35 people had gotten in. And I was like, yes, being a guy is awesome. And I was one of only 2 guys in the whole room. They're all, ladies. I was like, man, there's a lot of estrogen in this room. I was sitting there. I was like, this is it. I want to find something. And you can do pretty okay financially, too. And I was like, yeah, this is it. This is good. But at the same time, you got to go to school 4 days a week, and it's tough. And this isn't even the actual program. You have to do this in order to apply for the actual program, where they get 500 applicants and they choose 20. But I'm a guy, so it should be okay. But at the same time, knowing this, I was like, I have to give up pastoring in order to do it. I was like, this is good. So I've been wanting to give up pastoring for a long time. I've had a love-hate relationship with pastoring for a long time. And it was hard. So I was like, this is it. This is a good excuse. I'm going to study. I'll always serve God. I don't have to serve God as a pastor. I can serve God down there. I don't have to do VBS. I don't have to corral kids into people's rooms. This is it. This is finally something that I'm looking for. So I emailed our pastor, said, I might have to do this and I might have to quit. So I was like, okay. And I was really, really leaning toward this. I was like, I'm going to do this. And then we go to Atlanta to visit my in-laws. And I was like, wow, that's loads of fun. So we go. But I was like, but in Atlanta, there's this church that I've always wanted to visit, North Point Church. And it's always great to visit other churches every once in a while. And I was like, that was the highlight of my trip. And we went, and it was incredible. It's a huge church. You drive in, you turn on your flashers, and they tell you to go into this children's parking lot. I was like, this is efficient. As Sam would say, this is white people good. This church, man, white people know how to do service. They know how to park cars. So we go into the service. It's this huge sanctuary, and there's 2 of them. I was like, which one do we go? Because the guy only speaks live at one of them, and then he beams it to the other sanctuary and beams it to 20 other churches, right? There's like 20,000 members of that church. That's crazy. I was like, come on, live guy. And the live guy came. I was like, yes, God is good. And I'm sitting there, and I was like, man, I had pretty much decided right there, no more pastoring for me. I'm just going to be a member of the congregation. Be awesome. I tell Sarah that all the time. Be awesome just to be a member of the congregation. And we could have friends without being pastors and all that kind of stuff. That's cool. And we can drink beer and stuff like that and not feel guilty, with people in the congregation and all that kind of stuff. But this is awesome. I'm done. I'm ready to go. So I'm going to go to North Point first. So I'm watching this so the campus pastor comes over. That's what I call campus pastors. And he comes up and he does announcements. And I was like, this guy just preached the gospel twice. Whoa. And then they did this quick video and stuff like that. I was like, wow, that really ties into the theme of what they're talking about. And then it was baptism, and they had this baptism balcony. I was like, dang, white people. And it was awesome. And the baptism was about redemption and redeeming. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is gospel-centered baptism. Oh my, I'm being preached at the same time. Man, this is beautiful. I think there was an aura about me. Can you see my halo? This is awesome. And then the pastor comes out, and he was talking while I was listening. I was just glued to what he's saying. And I was like, man, he just addressed non-Christians 5 times. And I know that this guy does this because, you don't want to preach and talk about non-Christians as if they're not there. He wants to include them. So he addresses non-Christians 5 times, and I counted. And I was like, while I was doing this, and I had already decided I'm not going to be a pastor anymore, what was I doing? I was being a pastor. I was like, God, you're sneaky. Man, you are sneaky. I was like, man, I took pictures and I sent it to all our pastoral staff. And, man, white people good. That was this is awesome, It was such a weird thing. And then there was a little spark right there. And that night, I don't know too many people in Atlanta. But my old youth pastor was there. And she's the one that was instrumental in inspiring me and encouraging me to go into ministry. So I want to be a pastor. And yeah, without God, but also without her. So we went to go visit her. I haven't seen her in over 10 years. And, I used to carry her baby around, when I was a lot younger. Now he's going to college. I was like, I am old. So we're saying that we're trying to catch up. It was weird. I haven't seen her for 10 years. I started asking about her cousins. I forgot their cousins' names, but when I saw her, the names came back. How's your brother doing? I was like, man, I remember their names. How's everything going? And she's still doing youth ministry. She's in her 50s now. Don't tell her I said that. Okay? But she's in her 50s now, still doing ministry. She's a career youth pastor. And we were talking, and we were catching up, and I was listening to what she was saying, and then she said, I still go after those kids who are kind of on the fringe, kind of on the outside. And I go minister to them, and I just smiled and I said, you're still up to your old tricks again, and you haven't changed that, and you shouldn't change. And it was good to see her again, all that kind of stuff. We caught up and talked about kids, and she has 3 sons. And that night, I was just inspired to just email her, and I said, it was great to see you. And I just really wanted to thank you that, while you were saying, in our conversation tonight, that you really went out and looked for those fringe people. I was like, I was one of those fringe people that you looked after. I was really angry. I still am angry, but I was angrier back then, angry, just lost and searching for meaning, and you sought me out. And she's the one that got mad at me. And I never got offended when she got mad at me because she didn't get mad at me for herself. She got mad at me because of me. She said, I hate the way that you disrespect yourself. I hate the way that you allow people to walk over you. You're a much better person than that. And she'd be angry. I hate the way that you wear your clothes. Hey, stop right there. Don't go into that. Why? Because you don't respect yourself and love yourself enough to carry yourself in a certain way. She always encouraged me. She said, you're a good teacher, and you should continue teaching that. And when I saw her again, she said, I'm surprised you're not doing full-time ministry yet. I was like, I'm not crazy. I can't do that. And I just emailed her, and I said, I became a pastor because of you. And God has used me to bless people in my ministry, whether I realize it or not. And I want you to know that you had a hand in that. And a lot of people have been blessed because of what you did, that you sought out those people that are on the fringe, that people don't want to seek after. And I said, I wonder how many other pastors will come from your ministries as you do the same thing over and over and over again. And she emailed me back. She said, thank you for emailing me because, unbeknownst to you, and I kind of had an idea because she had hinted of this in our conversations, because I just came from a really difficult ministry situation. And she said where, it hurt me to the core. And she said she spent many nights crying and praying out and being angry at how people are in church. And she said, your email really helped me to focus on who I am and what I do. And I thought about this, and I was like, wow. And this woman, she's a tough cookie. She's not one to take things either. She's not one to get knocked down. She's gonna get back up, and she's going to knock you out. But for her to say something like, it hurt me to the core, it must have hurt pretty bad. But I realized that, in the midst of all this angst and stuff that I had, and I was like, man, I'm not doing ministry anymore as a pastor. I'll always do it in some other way. But I found some beauty in what God was doing. In the inconsistencies and in the hurt of people in ministry. Because for pastors, ministry is something that's very personal. Right? It's not a job where I can say, man, I make 6 figures, and my family's taken care of. And even though I hate my job, I still make my 6 figures. But you don't want to make too much. You don't want to make too little. You want to make just enough. So that's what Yoda Ree said. Right? And I understand that. But it's not one of those jobs. It's very personal to us. And yet there's still beauty in these things. And it started getting me thinking. I was like, I got to write this down for the sermon that I'm going to do in August. And there was another moment where I realized that there's some beauty in what God was doing. And I was doing this other sermon at one of my old churches, and we had this joint service, and we're in the main sanctuary, and everybody was there. And I was just having one of those angst-filled days, and I was just going to go off from the pulpit. Not necessarily at people, but about my experiences. I was like, man, this is what things are like, and I was just going off. And I saw one of my youth group parents come in and sit in the back. I was like, uh-oh, should I stop? I should talk about love and grace and all that stuff. I was like, no, I'm going. What are you going to do, fire me? Go. So I started going, and she's staring at me like a security camera. I mean, she's on me. At first I thought my zipper was undone or something like that, because she's staring, and she's looking at me. I'm just going off, and I'm being animated. I feel what I think is the Holy Spirit going through me, and I'm doing all that kind of stuff. At the end of the service, I pray and look up. She walks over to one of the youth group teachers. I was like, uh-oh. I don't know where this is going. And they go off to the side and talk. And I just kind of walk around, kind of close to where they're going, just kind of listen to what they're saying. And I looked at their faces, and they were very solemn, serious faces. I was like, uh-oh. Start sending out resumes. I'm out of here. I'm gone. And then after, the mother gets up, and she walks out. And the youth group teacher looks right at me. She said, this is never good. You know that. If you're married and your wife does this to you, it's never good. If you're Korean, it's like this. I'm sorry, But in America, it's like this, right? They tell you to come, you're in trouble, right? So I go over there. And now this youth group teacher is just like my older sister, So she said, sit down. Sitting down is no good. So I sit down. She said, I got to talk to you. So-and-so's mother wanted to talk to me. And I wanted to share this with you. And I had shared a lot of my frustrations with, my sister. And she said, I want to share with you what she said. I already know what she said. She said, I shouldn't be talking about things like that and frustrations from the pulpit. No, that's not what she said. So why do you think you know everything? I was like, okay, right? And she said, she heard everything that you had to say. And I was like, yeah, I know. She was staring at me the whole time. And she said, no. She said this. She thought, I can tell that Steve has been hurt in life and in ministry and in church. And I'm sorry that he had to go through something like that. I was like, sympathy. Yes. Sympathy. God. And then she said, but. I was like, God. She also said this, and I was like, what'd she say? She said, how can a pastor understand the pain and suffering of life and the suffering of people in the congregation if the pastor hasn't suffered and gone through pain himself? And she stared at me. I was like, dang it. She was saying all the things that you're so frustrated about, the meaninglessness of the things that you say, the things that you absolutely hate. And you talked about it. But this person was saying, it's good that you went through those things. Because how can you understand how other people go unless you have gone through it yourself? And it's a moment of beauty. I couldn't have manufactured that. I had to look above those circumstances and the contradictions and the hurts of what I've gone through and realize that God is in control of everything that happens to you. But if we try to interpret those things without God, we'll come to the conclusion that it's meaningless. Right? And when I think about that, there's so much beauty in the world around us. And there's so much beauty in the world around me. I was having conversation with some of our pastors, and I'll just listen to what they're saying. And one of our pastors is saying, they had lost a child. That's a tragedy, and that's tough. I can't imagine what it's like to lose a child. I look at, I'm one of those parents. I'm like hyper vigilant about my kids. The one time that I'm not hyper vigilant, I go, "You're too hyper vigilant." My son ran out of the store and into the parking lot by himself, and a parent had to bring him back in. So I became even more hyper vigilant, right? It's one of those things where you're hyper vigilant, but you're like, "Dude, relax, man. You're a little bit too much. Trust God." So he runs away. He'll be okay. He ran into the parking lot. So now I'm like walking him like a hawk. I'm going to buy a leash and a tranquilizer gun so I can shoot him from afar. And I can't imagine what it would be like to lose a child. I check to see if my kids are still breathing in the middle of the night. I go and I poke them. Oh, they're breathing. I can go to sleep. Sarah's like, "They'll be okay." I was like, "Wait till they're dead. You won't think that." But I make sure. So knowing that, to hear one of our pastors say, we lost a child, but we also adopted another child because we lost that child. I was like, in the midst of something so tragic, in the midst of something that's so senseless, it seems like, they can look above that and find meaning. God makes things beautiful in its time. And I listen to conversations of other people. How many, adoption is something that's very near and dear to my heart, at the same time very sensitive to. You don't know how many people I hear things like, especially Christians, and it bothers me when Christians say this, and I'm being a little bit judgmental, but it's okay. And when I hear, especially Christian women say, I can never adopt a child because it didn't come from my body, and I understand what it's like to not have that, and I can't love it the same as something that came out. I was like, what are you talking about? You sinned before God, and you're an enemy of God, and God sends his only son to die for you, and he loves you, and you're going to say something like that? It bothers the heck out of me. I understand what they're saying, because my own mother said that to me. I can never love you like my father, because you didn't come from my body. I was like, that's not my fault. I didn't have a choice. Right? I hear that all the time. But at the same time, in the midst of all that, there's people who have trouble having children. They say, we want to adopt. Like, that's not going to bother you? I'll say that because I always hear the other thing. No, it's cool. Who cares? When I hear who cares, it's kind of like, hey, calm down. That's a good who cares. Who cares? And I was like, wow, there's a beauty in that too. See, we become true to ourselves when we realize, I'll accept the world that it is, that it's meaningless, but I'm not going to stay there. I'm going to look above. And I'm going to find meaning because that's who I am. I am designed to find meaning. I'm wired to find meaning. And I'll find it beyond the circumstances that I'm in. Why is life beautiful? What I'm learning is that because God makes things beautiful in its time. See, in Solomon's observations, he found that being true to your desire for the eternal and acknowledging and accepting that life is inconsistent and contradictory, but not staying there and accepting the fact that you want something more and greater is what helps you to understand that life is beautiful. And there's so much beauty around this. If we could just ask God to give us the eyes to be able to see that much beauty around us. Right? And I hate the cliches, right? When life gives you lemons, make lemonade. I'll just buy it at the store. When God closes a door, he opens another. I'm going to climb through the window. Right? You only see a glass half empty. I see a glass half full. I just want a glass of water because I'm thirsty. I hate those types of cliches. Because they're weak attempts to find meaning in something that's meaningless without God. And so many people at the end of their life realize that, what was all this for? My mom said that too. What was all this for? This money is like paper to me. But we only find meaning when we have hope in something greater than ourselves, in the eternal. All right, let's pray.